If you didn't know, Miss Shannon is not going to be with you anymore. My name is Miss Denise, and I'm going to be taking over the fossils class on Saturdays. Um, Unfortunately, you missed my first meeting last week, and we can get you the PowerPoint or the video, and we'll just email that to you. And I'm not sure if you went to the one before that, but if you need it, then we'll also email you that one. Oh, he did? Okay, good. Then we can go ahead and get started here. Okay. Oh yeah, so the first thing I wanted to do was review what we did last time, just a bit. The first thing was that we went over was the modes of life and consumption habits of organisms. And I guess there are basically two categories that we can start off with. The first is, well, actually, the modes of life of all organisms. And there are two categories, including primary producers and the consumers. So I'm sure you've gone over this in your biology class before. The primary producers are the organisms that produce their own food through photosynthesis. So this is going to only include plants. We're not going to talk about any animals because there aren't, at this point, any photosynthetic animals. But there are plants, there are algae, and there are other single-celled organisms that have their own food made inside them, and they use just sunlight for that. And then the second main category is consumers. Obviously, they don't make their own energy, and so they have to eat either smaller animals or plants. And on the left here, we have just the two basic kinds of consumers, which are herbivores and which are heterotrophs, and they eat plants. They eat animals that they eat organisms that make their own food. And then we also have carnivores, which are consumers that eat herbivores and other carnivores. And so we also last week went over the feeding modes, including these six types that I have here. The first was parasites, which are animals that take nutrition from other animals without killing them. So one thing that this could be, for example, is like bugs. They often live on other animals. Something like a flea is a parasite. They live on other animals and they eat their blood, and but they're actually not that harmful to the actual animal. The second is scavengers, which derive nutrition from dead organisms. The example we gave in the last PowerPoint was a giant sloth that lived, I think, during the Jurassic period. The third kind was the suspension feeders, which are filter feeders basically. These mostly live in the water because we don't really have many food particles floating around the air. The fourth type is deposit feeders or detritus feeders. And these animals eat by digging into the dirt, usually in muddy water or at the bottom of the sea in the benthic area of the ocean. So they dig through the sand for small particles or dead animals or just small zooplankton that don't float. We also went over grazers, which just scrape food off of rocks and sand and things like that. And last we went over decomposers, which break down organic matter and convert it into something that they can eat. So let me know if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for me. I can slow down or I can go back a couple of slides if you need it. I don't know if you're taking notes or if you're just going to use the slides later. So, just let me know if you need me to stop. Oh, and also last week we went over the fossil rocks by types. So basically there are only a couple types of rocks that bear fossils, and those are sedimentary rocks. And I went over the 5 main types. You can go ahead and look at the slides later on. But the main ones that we went over are limestone rocks, which are rocks that are made of at least 50% calcium carbonate. The second were shale rocks, which are made of some of the same minerals, but they're actually characterized by their platiness and their layers. The third type we went over were sandstones, which are basically just conglomerates of sand, so they're very grainy, just like if you go to the beach. And then we also went over mudstones, which basically are very hardened rocks that are made out of mud, and coquina, which are conglomerates. And coquinas are made of mostly just pieces of shells and other like bivalves and clams that are broken down. Okay. So today we're going to talk about environments and these type of environments that organisms that have been fossilized used to live in. And we're also going to talk about some fossils that are found in these environments. And then the last thing we're going to cover is an introduction to systematics, or the way that we classify animals and how we categorize them into different groups. So fossilized organisms, like organisms that we have today, lived in either land or water. And the land dwellers are called terrestrial organisms, and the water dwellers are called aquatic organisms. So I just put some examples here so you can have a look at. Okay, so aquatic environments can be broken down into 4 different categories. The first is a marine environment, and that's basically the ocean. A marine environment, to be classified as a marine environment, must have 34 to 36 parts per thousand of total dissolved solids, or about 3.5% of salt. So this means that for every 1,000 units of water that you have, 34 of those units must be salt. So if you had, for example, 10,000 gallons of water, then 34 of those gallons would be made of salt. The second type is the non-marine environments, and that's basically the freshwater environment. So things like ponds, lakes, rivers, all that kind of stuff. Their salinity is much lower. They only have 1 part per thousand, and so they're only going to have 0.1% of salt. The third aquatic environment is called a brackish environment, and it's really a mixture of both fresh and salt water. And so these are usually found in the transition places between freshwater sources and the ocean. So places where the sea meets rivers, or the sea meets lakes, or just anywhere like bays or harbors, you can find the brackish environments. And the last type is called the hypersaline environment. And this is where there's going to be a very high amount of salt. Places like the Great Salt Lake, the Dead Sea, some bays and lagoons. And there's actually not that many fossils here because, like humans, a lot of organisms can't survive in a high salt environment. So if they drink water with a lot of salt, they're only going to get dehydrated. So there wasn't a lot of organisms around, so they weren't fossilized. Okay. And so in these environments, within the marine environment, there's actually a couple of zones that I think we should talk about. The first here is the pelagic zone of the ocean. So basically all this is everything except for the ocean floor. The ocean floor is actually called the benthic zone. So that includes the coast and the seafloor. And so everything besides that is going to be called the pelagic zone. And this zone can be divided into 2 parts. The first is the neritic zone, or the shallow zone. So basically this is the shallow part of the ocean. I don't know if you, when you go to the beach and you're walking into the ocean, there's usually a slope where it gets deeper and deeper, and you usually hit a ridge. And once you hit that ridge, there's often a drop. Once you pass that drop in the shelf, basically, that's when you get into the oceanic zone. So this is where the deep ocean is. So I can show you an image so it's going to become more clear. So all this up here where the slope is on this shelf right here, this is called the neritic zone. Everything past this, all this here, is the oceanic zone. But both the neritic and the oceanic are part of this whole pelagic zone, right? And like I mentioned earlier, all this sea floor is called the benthic zone, right? So I don't think you necessarily need this information, but this whole area is called the aphotic zone, all this down here, because that is too deep for the sun to penetrate. So like the word photosynthesis, it means light, like photic. And up here you have this lighter colored area. This is called the photic zone. So that's where the sunlight does penetrate. And that's part of the reason why up here in the neritic zone on this shelf, we're going to have a lot of organisms that we'll talk about later. So again, this here is a neritic zone over the continental shelf. Past that slope is called the oceanic zone, and the floor is called the benthic zone. Okay? Do you have any questions so far? Okay. So right now we're going to be talking about something called the rocky intertidal. And this is basically, if we actually go back to our slide, this here above the neritic zone, above the shallow water, is called the rocky intertidal zone. Okay? So near the shore, the organisms inhabit the littoral environment, or also known as the tidal zone. And this can be divided into three main parts: the supratidal zone, the intertidal zone, and the subtidal zone. So the supratidal zone is above the high tide. So usually this is the area that's towards the top where there's not going to be that much water. It's usually going to be dry unless there's going to be a high tide. For example, during the new moon or the full moon. That's when tides are the highest. So the animals that are exposed in this area are not going to be covered in water most of the time. The second, or the middle part, is called the intertidal, and this is between the high and the low tide. So this part is basically half and half. So half the time it's wet and half the time it's dry. As the ocean waves come in, it'll cover it, but as they recede, it'll leave the area exposed to the sun. And then the last, or the deepest part of the intertidal zone, is the subtidal, and this part is almost always going to be covered in water. So you have organisms that are that have evolved to live in this area. So usually you might also get some fish there because it's always underwater. They're never going to be exposed to the sun. And then one thing that I wanted to mention, so you know about this when I ask you about this later in your quiz, is that the organisms in the supratidal zone, that is the highest point in the rocky intertidal, they have more modes of protection. So you're going to have more hard-shelled animals in that area, because when you're at the top and not covered by water, you're actually going to be exposed to things like pollution, like from humans, for example. You're going to be exposed to sunlight. You're going to be exposed to wind, and most importantly, you're going to be exposed to waves. Because if you didn't know, the further you go into the sea, the less the waves are going to affect you. So if you're at this high point of the rocky intertidal, that's where the waves are going to be crashing and hitting you. So oftentimes, the organisms that live in this area, they're going to be fastened to the rocks using either like filaments, or they're basically going to dig holes in the rocks and use their muscles to stay grounded. Okay, so this is just an image of the different organisms we have here. The splash zone is actually above the different intertidal zones. So up here, you're going to have your animals that are fastened to the rocks, like I mentioned earlier. So these are going to be exposed to the waves the most. They're going to be exposed to the sun. And if you've ever been to the beach or an intertidal zone, you'll notice that these are actually really hard to remove from the rocks. If you ever try to remove a limpet or a barnacle off a rock, it's almost impossible. Maybe you could do it with some kind of hammer or a screwdriver, but usually they're really fastened, and that's because they've evolved to survive in this area. So here in the mid-tidal zone, we have things like mussels, crabs, and anemones. These are animals that do require water to survive usually. For example, an anemone will dry out if it is too high or if it never gets exposed to water, right? And the mussels, if you didn't know, mussels are filter feeders, so they do have to be covered by water at some point because they eat the particles that float in it. So obviously, if they were any higher, then they wouldn't survive in that because there's no particles floating in the air. Okay, and then we have the low tide zone here, or the deepest part of the rocky intertidal. And down here you have the softer animals, right? We actually do get some sea anemones in the lower area too, but we also get things like sponges, we get kelp, we get fish. So obviously these fish and these kinds of animals are not going to survive up here. They'd easily dry out. They can't breathe up there, and they have no protection. They have no hard shells like the ones you get up here, like the clams and the mussels that are up in this area. So do you have any questions about the rocky intertidal before we continue? Okay. And okay, let me move on to the next one. And I know that it's usually helpful to draw, but I don't have the tablet working right now, so for now we're just going to be using pointers for the most part. Towards the end, I will be drawing some things for you. Okay, so now we're going to go over the terrestrial environments and the fossils that we find in them. So we know that all fossils are formed by some method of burial, right? So that's why almost all of our fossil-bearing rocks are sedimentary rocks, because sedimentary rocks are found near bodies of water. Like we talked about earlier, things like sandstone, shale, limestone, these are all formed and found in the ocean. They're formed and found near rivers, near lakes, and basically the only exception to fossil being formed where there's no body of water is a desert environment, right? So even though a lot of animals don't live, even though there were many organisms that don't live near the ocean or in the ocean, many of the terrestrial organisms that we have found in fossils were fossilized because they live near things like lakes and ponds and rivers. And so today we're going to go over some of these areas and the fossils that we find in these areas. Not necessarily the organisms, but you'll see what I mean when we go on here. And so the terrestrial organisms, because they're terrestrial, they weren't in an ocean, but they still had to do things like drink water, right? So oftentimes we found them in these type of environments, or at least near them, and that would be the lacustrine environments, which includes lakes and ponds, the fluvial environments, which are rivers and streams, the paludal environments, which include swamps, and the aeolian, which are the deserts, basically. Okay? So the first thing I wanted to go over were the lacustrine environments, and all this means is that we have a freshwater environment that's either a lake or pond. But I did want to go over the fossils that are found in these areas, and this fossil here that I have on the right, this here, these ripples are created by the sediment at the ocean floor. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this fossil, these ripple fossils. The first thing that I have here on the left basically is just the names for a few parts of the fossil. So we call the top of this lump that we create here in the sediment, this is the crest. This peak here is the crest. The bottom is called the trough, and then from the top of the crest to the top of the next crest, that's called one cycle. And there are basically two types of ripple fossils. The first type is the symmetrical one. This is called a symmetrical ripple because we have basically the same length on both sides, right? So if you were to draw a line directly down this way, both sides would be even and the slope would be even. And this top one is created usually in an ocean environment. So if you were to go to the middle of the ocean, there usually is no current, but the water does move up and down, and these creates these symmetrical ripples. And this bottom one is an asymmetrical ripple, meaning that one side is going to be longer than the other. And this is because there's a current. So because the ocean, or rather the stream or the river, is flowing in one direction, you're going to have sediments pushing also in this direction. So the longer side is going to indicate the side in which the flow is, the direction of the flow rather. So symmetrical is always an ocean environment. So this is ocean. Oh, this doesn't work. And this is usually a river. I know it's really ugly, but okay. So here's another example of an asymmetrical ripple fossil. This is in an animated version, so I just wanted you to get a clear image of what it looks like in real life. So we can see here the ripple crest, so the top of the ripple, and then this here in the middle is called the trough. And we can see that this part is longer, so we can actually tell by the how long the side is here that the current was going to the west. And one thing I wanted to mention was that there are two names for the side of a ripple. One side is called the lee, and the other side is called the stoss. So if we go back to our previous image, the short side here, this is called the lee side of the ripple, and this long side is called the stoss side, right? Okay. The second thing I want to talk about in the lacustrine environment are mud cracks. So basically this happens when you get a lake or a pond that has dried up. So usually these are environments that are going to be in areas that are clay rich, and so once they dry, the clays actually shrink, because clay, to make clay you actually need water, but once the sun evaporates all that water, it causes the clay to shrink, and it creates all these cracks that you see here, right? And so as the sediment shrinks and cracks begin to form, it creates these polygonal structures here, right? And once this has happened, these cracks that it leaves here are actually filled in by other sediments. So, and then once these sediments fossilize, we are left of an imprint of the cracks. So this part here is the top part of the mud cracks. So all these spaces here were filled in with other sediments that have fossilized, and that's what we have here. All these lines here, this is the stuff that filled in the cracks. So it's basically like a sandwich, like that you've taken apart, and this part here is going to be the underside of the sandwich that was touching the cracked part. So it does leave an imprint. This is actually not the cracks itself. Okay, so the next terrestrial environment is the fluvial environment, where we find fossils. This is the rivers and streams, and it's not that long, this one, but I just wanted to go over this real quickly. So there are basically two parts that you should know about the fluvial environment. The first thing is a alluvial fan, sorry. So an alluvial fan is this structure here. And all it means is that you have a narrow stream or a narrow river that is going to fan open. It just fans out like this. All it means is something narrow that fans out, and usually it comes from places between mountains or a valley, somewhere where it's going to be restricted, right? And once it gets out of that mountain range or that valley, it's going to fan out in this structure. And then the second thing that you should know about is called a braided stream. All that means is that there are streams that cross over. Again, this image includes both the fan here and the and the braided streams. I'm sorry, what did you want me to spell out for you? I just saw your message. Oh, Lee and Stoss. Yeah, it's Lee and Stoss. So Lee is the shorter side, and Stoss is the the longer side. So if we go back real quick, I wanted to mention the lee side is the drop off right here, and the stoss side is going to be this longer side. Okay. So here's some here's some actual images of these things. On the left, on the right here, we have the alluvial fan. We have this river that actually used to exist here. This is just the fossils that it's left behind. This whole structure here, right? Because this is actually dried up at this point. So there was a river or stream that came between these mountains, and then once it got out of those mountains, it fanned out in this way here. And the other one here I have on the left are the braided streams, right? And this isn't a fossilized form or anything. This is an actual stream that still exists. So just so you get an idea what it looks like. All right, and the last part about terrestrial environments, well, water environments in terrestrial land, are the swamps or the marshes. Now, swamps and marshes differ from lakes and ponds in the way that they're usually engrossed by plants. So usually you're going to find a very thin layering of algae on the top. They're not going to get that much sunlight under that. So because algae block out the sun, there's not going to be as much organisms that live in the water because there's not enough plants for them, underwater plants, to be to support the life that's down there. But you are going to get algae over the top, and you're going to get a lot of plants on the side that take up the nutrients. And usually these swamp areas are in transition areas between terrestrial and aquatic environments. So at the end of a river or a stream, or from a lake into a terrestrial setting, there's going to be a place where it gets muddier and muddier, and it's going to get darker, and there's going to be more algae, and that's what we call swamp. It's just that transitional area between the aquatic and the terrestrial areas. Okay. And right, the last one that we're going to talk about that's not an aquatic setting, but we do find fossils in, is the aeolian setting, and this basically just includes deserts. So there are some fossils that we find in deserts, and the way that they get buried is just by very large gusts of wind. So if you remember, we do need some burial, and although it's kind of rare because sand is actually harder to move than you might think, it is blown easily in small amounts, but it takes a very large gust of wind to blow enough sand off of a dune to cover a whole organism. However, we do get some examples. And the fossil I want to talk about in this environment is actually called crossbedding. And you can see an image of what crossbedding is right here. So this is all called crossbedding, and we're going to go over this. So basically, we have crossbedding when the wind is blowing the sand over. And this is how dunes are actually created. We do have actually sand dunes here in California, so if you're ever interested in going there, we have something called the Eureka sand dunes. They're about 4 hours north of here, and they're actually the biggest sand dunes that we have in the United States. And so, just as a side note, so sand dune deposition, migration, and the formation of crossbedding. So we have a bunch of sand, and in an area where there's high velocity wind, we have this happening here. On the left, we have these particles of sand being carried over. And if you remember, this side here is called the stoss side of the dune, or of the ripple, but it's also applicable to the sand dunes. So this long side is called the stoss, and this short side is called the lee. So high velocity winds are picked up and they're blown over in the direction of the wind, right? And on the leeward side, the wind speed drops, right? Because if we have the wind going this way, then if there's already a pile of sand here, the speed of it is going to drop because you're blocking most of the wind that's passing by. So the grains, they accumulate in layers, and they create these kind of rows that you can see here on the real life image. And usually these lines here indicate the direction of the wind. So if the lines are sloping as they are here to the right, here to the right, they're going this way as opposed to sloping this way, then it means that our wind was actually blowing in this direction. So if we look at this image here, we see that, like in the other image, our lines are sloping this way. So in this area, the wind was blowing in this direction. However, if we look up a little bit higher, we see that there are some lines that go this way. So that means that at this point, for these couple of years that it took for these sands to form, that the wind had changed direction. And yeah, there are other sand dunes in Death Valley too. So that's basically all that crossbedding is these marks that it leaves here that indicate the direction of wind. Okay, so if we go on to the next one. So now we're gonna have just a small change in gears. We're gonna talk about an intro to systematics. I don't know how far you've gotten. I know that they do go over systematics in biology classes often. But just like in biology, the organisms that have been fossilized are categorized into the same kinds of groups. So when we group organisms based on their similarities, we call these things taxonomic groups, or another word for it is taxa. And these groups are based off of the structure and the form of the animals that we see. So basically, in the same way that we categorize dogs and cats and everything that's alive today, we do with fossils. So we look at the organisms that we find in these fossils, and we find their similarities, we find their structural similarities. Today we do it with, for the modern day animals, we often use DNA to find which animals are closely related. However, this isn't really possible with fossils because fossils are just minerals. All they are minerals or other substances that have taken place of the original organism. So there's usually no way we can get an organism's DNA. So today we have to use mostly things like the structure, the bones, their environment to classify and organize the fossils. And so we group fossils into the same groups that we group modern day animals. And these are kingdom, the phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And so as you go down the list, you're actually getting more and more specific. When you're at the kingdom, you're going to have, this is going to be the most general group that there is. So this is going to include all types of animals. And as you move down, the organization gets more and more specific. So you get closer and closer related animals as you move down this list. Right? And once you get to the level of species, however, you're only going to have one animal because every organism has a species name, and anything else that's not in that species isn't going to be that same organism. So once you're down here, there's only one organism left. Okay, so just as an example for you, this is what we use to classify our animals, and this is a modern day one. So for example, here we have the kingdom Animalia, and that's going to include all types of animals, right? So it's going to include all mobile, multicellular organisms that can't synthesize their own nutrients. So these are all heterotrophs, meaning they all either eat plants or they eat animals that eat plants. And so this kingdom has a ton of animals. So even we only have like 10 here, but there's actually much, much more. And now as we move down through phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, we're going to get more and more specific. For the phylum, we have chordates here, and chordates are something that have a skeletal, like basically a spine. Here they call it a skeletal rod, but it's your spine and all the nerves that connect to that spine. So all these animals have that, and that's why we don't include the butterfly down here, because insects actually don't have one. And as we move down class, we go to amphibians, and all these animals are cold-blooded, so we no longer include cats and rabbits and birds because those are not cold-blooded, right? So as we go down, we get more specific with the characteristics that we're looking at. So down at the genus, we have frogs with horizontal pupils. So that means that it's, their eyes are very specific, right? And once we get down to species, there's only one animal that fills in every characteristic that we're looking for, and that's this species called Littoria cervatea. So this species of frog is going to have all these characteristics. It's going to be multicellular. It's going to have a spine. It's going to be an amphibian. It's going to have all of these characteristics, but it's going to have a very distinctive ear holes and head glands that make it its own species. So that's how we categorize every single animal and every single fossil. And it's a lot of work because we're going to end up with literally millions of animals that are alive and millions that are dead. So the area of systematics is actually its own study of area. So you can go into biology, but you can also go into systematics, or you can go into cladistics, which we'll talk about just a little bit. So I'm sure, like, as you can tell, like, if you're going to be categorizing every animal, it's going to be a lot of work. So people make careers out of this thing. And so we're just going to go over a couple of the things that we're going to be covering next week, and that you're going to have to study for the Science Olympiad tournament. So there are basically 5 kingdoms of organisms, and they include these here, and that's the Animalia, which are just, basic animals, anything that moves and has a lot of cells. Then we have Plantae, which is plants, Monera, which is the bacteria, and blue-green algae. So this is actually a separate phylum from a plant. These are not the same things. And then we actually have the mushrooms and the fungus here. And then we have the Protista. Oh, well, it used to be called Protista. Now it's called Protoctista. And these are single-celled organisms. And we find all types of fossils, including from every kingdom. However, for your Science Olympiad, we're basically going to focus on animals and plants. And so we do have a couple of organisms from the protists and from the Monera. The stromatolites are one example, which are actually cyanobacteria, and you should be able to identify that by the time you go to the competition. And for the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the phyla. And there are a ton of phyla that you don't really need to know, because there are both invertebrates and vertebrates, but the ones that are preserved as fossils usually are going to be these here. So the Porifera phylum are going to be sponges. So we do have a lot of fossilized sponges. The secondary is the Cnidaria, which are the corals and the jellyfish. The third is the Bryozoa, which is the moss animals. The fourth, which you've probably seen a lot of, is the Brachiopoda. So these are brachiopods or lamp shells, right? Anthropoda, these include insects, spiders, crabs, shrimp, trilobites. So this one's actually pretty common. One reason is because they're characterized by their joints and by their hard shells. And so we get a lot of fossilized organisms from this phylum. We also get a lot of fossilized organisms from the mollusca phylum, because again, they have those hard shells that are going to be they're going to be a really good way to they're really good for preserving, is what I mean. Soft shell things are not preserved that well, and things like sponges and jellyfish, those are almost they're not, I wouldn't say that they're impossible to find, but they're rare when you compare them to things like clams and snails and all these other ones that are pretty common. And then we have the Echinodermata phylum. So these are the sandfish, the sea dollars, the urchins, the crinoids, and these are not as common as the mollusks and the Anthropoda, but they're still pretty common. You'll find a lot of starfish and sea urchins and sand dollars. Yeah, and so all these here are invertebrates, and then the vertebrates were the ones that we talked about earlier. Vertebrates are going to be things like dinosaurs or mammals, basically anything that has a spine. If you think about all these, they're all going to be mostly ocean-dwelling animals that don't have a spine. They're going to be, soft animals or animals that have a skeleton that's outside of their body. So that's why they're fossilized very easily. Okay. So this thing here is called a cladogram. And like I mentioned earlier, the study of organizing animals into different groups and their relationship to other animals, that's actually called cladistics. Let me write that in here for you. Cladistics. So that's the study of the organization of these animals. And taxonomy is actually the study of naming animals. So there's actually a lot of information that we're not going to be able to cover today, but I did want to go over cladistics and taxonomy. So taxonomy is basically how we name animals, and we just name them based off of their similarities to other animals. The person who started the naming and the organization of the animals is actually called Carl Linnaeus. So Carl Linnaeus was the first person to name animals based off their characteristics. So he would use things like their teeth, their jaws, their structure, their form to name animals. And so when he saw two animals that had similar attributes, he would name them similar things. And that's how he first started categorizing things. And this structure here we use is called a cladogram, and it basically is used to show the relationship between animals. So for example, here we have Canis lupus and Canis latrans. So this is a wolf and a fox. So all this means is that these two animals here are connected by these rows, by these lines here. And this is basically telling us that these two animals are more closely related to one another than they are to this panther or to these a possum and a badger. So when we have two animals that are shown like this in a cladogram that are right next to each other, this is actually called, these two will be called that looks not good, but I'll write it down for you in the chat too. So these are actually called sister taxa, and that's because they're connected here to the same node. Every point here where the lines for the type of animals meets, these are called nodes, and these nodes represent a common ancestor. So when we have this fox and this wolf connected here to this one node, this means that at one point in the evolutionary timeline they had a common ancestor, and this common ancestor was going to have similar characteristics to these animals here. And so this common ancestor was going to lead to these two strains of animals. So all that means is that these animals came from a common ancestor. So just like humans and apes, we all came from a common ancestor. So if you were to look at a cladogram of us, we'd be closer to the apes than we would be to something like a cat or a cockroach or something like that. So cladograms are just used to show us a relationship between animals and how closely they are related. And these nodes, again, they represent the most common ancestor, right? And one thing that I wanted to mention is that when we're naming species, it always includes both the genus name and the species name. So the genus is going to be the more general term. If you remember our hierarchy of names, that's if we look back at our hierarchy, the genus is up here, so there's going to be different animals in this group, and the species is down here. And this is actually called the taxonomic hierarchy, if you didn't know. Taxonomic hierarchy, just for your reference, right? So when we name these animals, oftentimes if they're in the same genus, we're going to include the genus name inside of their species name. So every species name includes the genus and the species. And the genus is always going to be capitalized, and the species name is always going to be lowercase, just like we have here. And this is actually called the binomial naming system, where we have these two names. Let me write that down for you. That's called a binomial naming system. All it means is that there's two names, right? So it's going to include the genus and the species name. Right, so that's basically all we have for lecture. And I hope I didn't go too fast for you. I am going to ask you a couple of questions. If you need me to go back at all, let me know. So this is what we're going to have a look at. The first thing is here is, can you tell me in which direction the wind was blowing when we look at this area of the rock formation? Which direction was the wind blowing? If let's say this is west and this way is east, what direction is the wind blowing when we look at these sediments? That's actually not right. It's actually blowing to the east. So it's a little harder to tell here, but we can see it's slightly sloping this way, right? And if you remember, our direction of the wind is going to be in the direction of the slope. So if we look at this area here, we can see that it's slightly sloping this way, right? Okay, so the next one is, which side is the lee and which side is the stoss? So let's say this is one side, this long side, and then we have this short side here. Do you remember what the short side is called and what the long side is called of these ripples? So we have this long side and this short side. Long is a stoss and lee is a short. That's right. Good job. Okay, so what else do we have? Okay, this one's going to be a little bit harder. So I want you to take a look at the characteristics. These are two fossils. The first is a sponge. Rather, the one on the right is a sponge. So think about what kind of environment this fossil would have lived in. And the one on the left here is a mussel or a bivalve. So remember, if we remember our intertidal zones, they're going to have different exposures to water. So which intertidal zone, the lower, the middle, or the upper, did the mussel live in, and which intertidal zone did the sponge live in? That's right. That's right. So the mussel is actually the mussel is in the mid-tidal. So if you remember, the mussel is more protected, but it is also a filter feeder. So it does have to be underwater at some points. So it's actually in the mid-tidal zone. And you got the sponge one correct. So the sponge is not protected and it can't be exposed to sunlight or predators as much. So you got that one correct. Okay. Oh, and this one's kind of hard. Hopefully you'll get it. If you can tell me, first off, let's see. What is this area called? All this lighter colored area where the sunlight hits. So remember the word that we use for light. That's close. Yeah, it's called photic. So that's the photic zone. And so if that's the photic zone, then what's all this area that doesn't get hit by light? Aphotic, that's right. Okay. So one more actually. If we remember the pelagic zone, it's split into two parts. There's the part that's the shallow one, and there's the part that's the deep part of the ocean. Do you remember what they're called? This shallow area, and then everything else, which is the deep area. This one's a little bit harder, I think. Neritic and oceanic. Yeah, good job. Okay. Last question. Do you know what this whole area is called? down here, the coast, or the ocean floor rather. The continental shelf is actually this part right here. Right. But all this down here is actually its own zone. If you remember, it's called the benthic zone. Right? So the ocean floor is the benthic zone, and the continental shelf is all this area up here. This little ridge is where it ends. Okay? So that's all I have for today. And I think that next week we're not there on the schedule. There's no session, but I might have to talk to the center, to Miss Chris and to Miss Joyce, because I think we might be a little bit behind just because we started late and we've been switching teachers and whatnot. And we'll make the PowerPoints available to you. And if you have any questions, let me know, or go ahead and send us an email. All right? That's going to be all that we have today. The species on the list, I don't think that we're going to have a chance to go through all of them. Next week, I am going to go through some of them, but it's also up to you, because if you go on the official Science Olympiad website, there is a sheet of paper. They have a PDF where you can download all of them. I will go over the main phylums and the main genuses and stuff. Okay. Yeah, so we're gonna go over the main ones, but you might have to go over them on your own. You know, I have some resources that we can send you, I think, but for the most part, we're not going to have time to cover all of them inside one PowerPoint or something like that, because there's just way too many of them, okay? So you are going to have to study on your own and just go off of that list. You know, it's mostly about memorization, and I know a lot of the names are difficult because they're the scientific names, but I think a good way to practice is just put them on flashcards and stuff. But we will go over the important ones next week. Okay? Okay, I'll see you next time then. Bye-bye.